validating episode of the Omni Talk Ask an Expert series. I'm one of your co-hosts for today's interview, Ann Mazenga.
And I'm Chris Walton.
And we're the founders of Omni Talk, the fast-growing retail media organization that is all about the companies, the technologies, and the people that are coming together to shape the future of retail. Chris, we cover quite a few cool, groundbreaking retail technologies on this show, both in store, online, every week in our Fast Five. But I feel, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like every time we talk about this new tech and we talk to the retailers who are deploying it, there's one thing that it comes down to for the success of any of these pilots, and that is whether or not a retailer has a good handle, or a brand have a good handle on their item data. Are you in agreement?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, like, if I think back to the start of this year, particularly, like I think back to all the interviews we did with key executives at NRF, at Manifest as well, the supply chain conference, every single one of them, when you ask, like, what is the key foundational piece to omnichannel retailing, every single one of them says item data.
Yes.
It's a no-brainer.
Yes.
But yet it's so hard to do.
For sure. Even the most, like, some of the most brilliant schnooks that we've named most innovative grocer. I think of Sam's Club, one of the most innovative retailers, like Walmart. They're still working on it. Key point here. So that's why we have created this session today, strictly focused on item data. And we've called in two experts. We have Nick Schwalbach and Brandon Pierre of SPS Commerce to help our audience get their heads around how to get their item data set up correctly so that it's ready to support the now, next, and future needs of their business. So with that, Brandon, Nick, welcome to the show. Nick, you're a first timer, so I'm going to go to you first. How are you feeling? Did Brandon properly prep you for this?
Brandon and I get the opportunity to work together very closely. So yes, he did a great job.
on a few flights recently, it sounds like, too. You can spend a lot of quality time.
Just a few, and then a few more. Yep.
Brandon, are you ready to be back in action doing this again?
I am. I'm excited. And I loved your open. I will just say we were at NRF as well. We had 30 customer meetings with retailers, and every one of them was talking about item data. So it is a hot topic right now.
Yeah, it's always the funny thing. Like, when I read the earnings reports, I'm waiting for the CEO to say, you know, when he gets asked the analyst question, what are you focused on? I'm waiting for the CEO to say item data, because that's what starts everything, right? That once the CEO says it, then everybody's doing it. And that tells you who gets what really matters in the future of omnichannel retail. Like, it starts there. It 100% does. And the digital people know that, but then it's about getting it through the rest of the organization, which is partly why Ann and I do what we do every day at Omni Talk. All right, now before we get started, just a quick reminder for those watching live on LinkedIn, feel free to ask your questions of Brandon and Nick at any time via the chat session window to the right-hand side of your screen if you're on your desktop, or below the video if you're on mobile. All right, so let's get started. Why don't we have each of you explain a little bit about your roles at SPS Commerce? And Nick, let's start with you.
Yeah, for sure. So I've been at SPS Commerce now for 13 years. I grew up in retail. And so switching over to SPS Commerce was a very easy transition for myself. So I'm a senior director on our product management team. And so my team works very, very closely with all of our retailer, grocer, distributors, all of our customer base that we work with here at SPS Commerce, in very close conjunction with Brandon's team, customer success. Our sales team really focused on, you know, what are those CEOs talking about on the earnings calls? Like, what are the top things that those retailers, grocers, distributors, customers are really talking about? And then how do we bring products, technology, people, process, consulting, whatever it might be, to market to go help meet those needs and really enable their supply chain in a different way than how it operates today?
Yeah, you guys are always great about talking about the people, the process, and the technology being like the three legs of the stool to make any successful venture happen. I always kudos to you guys for doing that too. I'm glad you brought that up right in the beginning, because it's a good reminder for everyone watching. Brandon, how about you?
Yeah, so like Nick, I grew up in retail. Started in a small family business retail, and then moved to the big box side. So so Nick and I have a lot in common. I've been at SPS 8 years, so not quite as long as Nick. But I have very much enjoyed my time at SPS. And so my team's really responsible for working with our retailers directly. We have over 2,000 retailers in our network that we work with. And my team's constantly going into these retailers, kind of looking at what the current state of their processes are, where the data gaps are, where the challenges are that they're seeing. And then we help them understand kind of where those gaps are that can be solved by simply getting better, more accurate information from their suppliers. And then also helping them, once they get that data, thinking through how their processes change as a result. And so that's largely what my team's doing. And so we're working very closely, obviously, with Nick on the product side as well.
So Brandon, are you boots on the ground and Nick is more like the strategy level? Is that a good way to encapsulate that, or am I simplifying it too much?
I would say you're simplifying it a bit. Whether Nick likes it or not, he sets the strategy, and oftentimes I'll pull him into it with customers because
right.
Well done.
And he agrees with it. There's no better way than actually spending time with our customers, hearing how our strategy is either working or not working, and where their business is going and looking to go. So he spends a lot of time on the road with me.
Yes.
Well, let's dive into a little bit of what SPS does, what your boots on the ground talking to customers about. Nick, for those audience members who are joining for the first time and learning about SPS, maybe you could just give us a little background and why, the two of you are uniquely positioned to kind of help the listeners get their item data houses in order.
Yeah, for sure. So SPS Commerce, so we've been around for 20 plus years working with retailers, grocers, distributors, and all of their suppliers that enable their supply chain. So we are a supply chain company really focused in kind of that retail space, as we kind of define that as retailers, grocers, distributors, and those people that really have vendor communities, and then the vendors that support them. And where we're focused in on is kind of that order and item life cycle. So we start with the item side, which is where we're going to spend obviously a lot of time today. Like, how do retailers and decide what items they're going to carry, and then how do we get that item information in, to then stepping into the order cycle, all the way from, hey, I'm issuing that first order, all the way through notifications, shipments, returns, those types of information. How do we move goods amongst our supply chain, transportation management, and then really kind of bookending that with our point of sale data, right? So obviously, if I'm a supplier and retailer, I not only need to collaborate during the order cycle, but I also need to look at what's coming next season, or how did things perform in season, or what lack of snow in the Midwest, but they're getting hammered in the Rockies right now, right? Like, how do we move inventory around? So how do we analyze those trends together through the sharing of point of sale data or other means of sharing sales information, inventory information with their customer base?
Excellent.
All right. So I think, as every loyal Omni Talk follower knows, I'm a lifelong merchant. I talk about it all the time on our weekly podcast. And Brandon, you and I used to work together at Target too, for the backstory there. But so I want you to talk about item data, and I want you to answer this question candidly, Brandon, first. So if you were to grade retailers, and you can use whatever schema you want, letter grades, numbers, 1 to 10, whatever, percentages. Where are retailers at when it comes to item accuracy right now?
Wow, starting with the tough one.
Oh yeah.
I will say on a letter grade scale, I would say on average a C, and that I think is probably being gracious. And one of the things I would say, just even in the letter grade, is the demands of item information are changing pretty constantly too. And so even when they think they have it nailed, the consumer demand and where the channels exist is constantly pushing it. But in a general basis, I'd say passing, maybe to slightly passing, but not happy either way with where they're at.
Yeah, passing, because they're getting goods into customers' hands, but it's just kind of the nature of the beast. But there's so much low-hanging fruit, I'm guessing you guys both think, as do Ann and I, in terms of doing it better and doing it more efficiently. And your point, right, too, is 100% right. Like, the dynamics, particularly the digital side of the business, are always evolving to such a degree that it's almost always a moving target too, that you've got to continually focus on it and get better. Nick, are there any points you'd add there?
Yeah, so I think I see on some instances is maybe a lower grade, and see some instances, I think, Brandon, for some of the companies we walk into and help them, is actually a high grade. But I think it's accurate, because a lot of organizations actually, when we start talking to them, item data might not be the focus of how we get in the door and start talking with them.
Right.
But when you start unpacking that with organizations, they think that they're doing a good job because it's working, right? Obviously, without item data, I don't have anything to sell, advertise. I don't have anything to stock a store, whether it's an e-com store or a physical store, right? Like I don't have that. So I must be doing okay. But when you really start unpacking and open the eyes, it's like, well, I mean, it is the 21st century and you are doing everything via Excel with customers. And then, by the way, you have to email back and forth 20 times just to communicate that. And they don't understand what you're trying to do, right? And you're taking time away from people that's not their core competency, right? Like, do you really want your buyers, merchants really working with vendors on that? Or do you want them figuring out, like, what is the category I should be carrying? Like, what is the next item coming up? So I think it is one of those things where I think we're a harsher critic because we see behind the curtain a lot more than maybe other organizations do. But at the same time, if you look at it, there's opportunity there that brings efficiencies not only to that section, but then the rest of their supply chain too, because it starts with item, but then the base of everything that happens is around item too. And I think sometimes that gets lost too, that you need good item information all the way through, not just starting at the front with the order cycle.
Yeah, right. That's funny, Nick, because it reminds me of something that somebody was telling us recently, like they're doing this all in Excel, and then somebody who had worked there for 20 years leaves, and then they're left with this person's Excel sheet and calculations and everything that are in that document. And it's like,
right.
How are you still running a business this way?
Yeah.
But,
yep. 100%.
Well, the other issue that we brought up when we were preparing for this session is what you have also encountered, which is that a lot of retailers and brands that you've worked with, they're investing in PIM systems, and then they're just like, all right, check done. We're out of here. We're on a roll. We can sell things. We're great. But tell us a little bit about, how you can approach this and how you've worked with clients in these situations to help them understand, like, no, it's more than that. And it gets back to, I think, the unique visibility that you have once you start working with brands, I'd imagine.
Yeah, for sure. So, so PIMs are very similar to almost any system that or retailer, supplier, anybody has, right? You're only as good as the information or the inputs, outputs of that system. And, and PIMs have done a great job realizing there's an item problem out there. And item is different, right? Like ERPs, they handle item to a certain extent, but what they don't handle is well, I need to feed specific information to my WMS, to my e-commerce site, maybe to some third parties, so on and so forth. And so the PIMs really were born out of the fact that item information, I need this central place where marketing, where supply chain, where my merchants can all collaborate. And then that information needs to be dispersed to other systems. But so much of that base information comes from their suppliers to start everything, right? Whether it's I use the PIM in order to evaluate the items I'm even going to go buy, or I do that manually and then I bring them into the system and it feeds the PIM. And that process where a supplier is trying to share their item information, or a retailer, distributor, grocer trying to gather that item information, is really where that like contentious, manual, time-consuming process happens. And then so we're really where we look at the world is, just like the ERP, just like everything else, you need to partner with your supplier community if you want to make a difference there. And a lot of the PIMs have maybe gone and, they've created a portal that allows customers to go enter their information in, which is a great start. But a lot of companies have systems that they want to integrate with. And in a PIM, in order to specialize, these customers want to send it from QuickBooks, and these want to come from NetSuite, and they maybe another PIM, maybe it's their competitor, right? Like a supplier is using a PIM too. And so where SPS kind of sits in there, at least where we believe that the need there is, PIM is great. If you have a PIM, that's awesome. A lot of companies don't have PIMs, whether it be money, time, other priorities, whatever it might be. You still need to engage that vendor customer base. And that's really where we believe like the fruit is on the tree, like still hanging there, like for us to go grab is like, how can we help enable those vendors and those retailers to work together to seed that better into the PIM, and then allow the retailer to use that as their core competency of where does that information have to go? Well, how do we use it? How do we disperse it? So on and so forth. So we really started to look into like partnerships with PIMs and as how do we help augment them? It's not a SPS Commerce or another competitor of SPS or like EDI versus a PIM. Like there is a need for both of them, again, because EDI, just like, in the order space, item data is no different. It's only as good as what I can collaborate with my vendor community on. And then what do I do with that information after I have it? Just like ERPs are not, great at going out and getting information from your suppliers. They're not good at following up. Did I get an ASN? Am I, that information? PIMs are just the same thing for item.
So Nick, I want to make sure that we stop there and put a pin in that too. So you're saying like, the real sweet spot for you at SPS and the real sweet spot you see or the need in the industry is really to be the connecting tissue between the supplier's data and what ultimately goes into the PIM system. Am I saying that back to you correctly?
Yep. Yeah. No, that's spot on. Yep. Spot on.
And Brandon, I imagine you're seeing this firsthand with some of the customers that you've been out, boots on the ground talking to. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about what you're hearing from existing brands and retailers.
Absolutely. I mean, one of our better sales cycle initiators is actually when a retailer's put a PIM in already, right. And then they come to us and they're like, "Oh shoot, we put this PIM in, but
it's like chum in the water.
We can't get any of this." It's like, "Oh, well, that's great. Let us talk to you about how we can help you." But for the most part, most retailers that we're talking to are in the process of trying to figure out whether they want to put a PIM in place or not. Okay. And a lot of what we try to help them with is a PIM might absolutely be the right solution for you, but ultimately you're going to need to get the data from the supplier. And your best chance of getting the data from the supplier is not forcing the supplier to give you that data in your language. Right. And that's a big part of where SPS plays a role is you retailer might call it color, or they call it color tone. Well, right. If you're forcing them to always be figuring out how to put it in your language, the supplier may have it, but not even know how to get it to you. And so a large part of what we're trying to help retailers understand is you need a common set of language, regardless of what system you're putting it into, and giving your suppliers the ability to provide it in their language. And that is where you start to see some of this potential be unlocked, of where I, as a supplier, want to do it, but man, if I have to put it in the retailer's language every single time, that's really
for every retailer and brand that they're working with too. Like it's different across the board, right?
Absolutely.
It's totally hamstringing. And I mean, I remember living this firsthand. I mean, yeah. I run an e-commerce for home for Target firsthand and seeing like us, I don't want to say struggle, but it slowed us down. The lack of having the ability to do what you talked about and to even have the supplier supported in the way that you're talking about, or having them connected with something like what you're describing, it just slowed us down in terms of the effort of growing the business, and the business was taking off at the time. So, all right, so let's shift gears a little bit. So one question we always like to ask, if we can, is, as you think about your partners or others in the industry, who do you think is preparing their item data in the right way? Who can the industry learn from? Nick, let's go to you.
Yeah, so I think there's the item space, maybe more so than other spaces we play in, or that some of the segments, it seems to be a little bit more fragmented, right? It's fairly new, right? For as far as people trying to really double down and focus here, and e-com, like I think was a big driver of that, but that was more of a big driver of like my extended attributes, right? My extended descriptors, so I can have it on my website, maybe, buy online, pick up in store, so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But what, where we are coaching our retailers to start, and where we look at our partners to help with too, is how do you actually back that up? Because you just like building a house, you can't, if you don't have a good foundation, you can't really go add on that second, third story, whatever it is you might want to add on there. And so when we look at people that are doing this really well, that core information, it all started with, there was a few standard bodies, right? GS1 has some standards out there. There is the GDSN data pools that exist out there, right? But what actually ends up happening is a lot of those data pools, they only have like certain verticals that they play in, right? Like GDSN plays really, really heavy in like grocery, CPG, like those things. The GS1 standards, those were started by a lot of clothing retailers back in the day. And so they do really, really well in kind of soft lines. But as you have retailers now that are on a lot of different categories, so on and so forth, it does become like a little bit of disjointed experience, right? There's a lot of companies, movers and shakers in the space, as far as like, Syndigo came on the scene a few years ago, and they've made a bunch of acquisitions of a lot of different companies. There's a lot of people using Salsify as maybe their own internal PIM from a vendor side. But as you guys talked about, they don't necessarily maybe take on some of that translation capabilities of getting into the different retailers. So, there are a few of us out there, SPS Commerce included, that is looking at this as a holistic approach, right? There's only a certain number of suppliers that exist inside the ecosystem of a retailer, right? If you divide it in percentages, like 10 to 15% usually have their item information figured out, right? If you're a Target, the Pepsis, the Cokes, the P&Gs, right? They all do this for so many different retailers. They kind of have it figured out. But what are you doing with the long tail of those suppliers? And that's where the spreadsheet, the manualness comes into play. And that's really what we hear from our retail base, is like, there isn't really one thing there. So how can we help, take in whatever the suppliers have? If they're using Salsify, they're using Syndigo, they're using GDSN, whatever that might be, how can we sit in the middle and really help that retailer streamline that process into a PIM or into some other systems? It doesn't really matter to you.
Right. Brandon, what's your perspective on this question? And I'm curious too, are there any case studies or examples you can share that, double click into this for the audience?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple thoughts. When I think about some of the retailers out there that I've seen tackling this better than others. One of the areas we see retailers actually do this pretty well is when they come with a very specific set of item attributes they're looking for, tied to tackling a very specific business problem. So one of the big complexities out there right now is shipping air, or the amount of dead space inside of distribution centers, or over maximized space within distribution centers, simply because item dimensions are not understood. So for example, we saw one retailer go out to their supplier base and, through being very specific on the information that they were looking for, saw almost 90% of their items within that distribution center now have clear item dimensional attribute tied to that, to be able to better optimize their DC space, as well as their freight lanes and how they're moving goods. So when retailers can get very specific on it, suppliers can understand it, and suppliers know the information. Therefore, okay, I now know what you're trying to do.
Brendan, so let me stop you for a second. So if I yes and that, you're saying, like, is that that's a good approach for retailers to take to get comfortable with this discussion? Is like, hey, let me zero in on one metric that I need to improve, and let me go whole hog on trying to improve that. And the dimensions is a great one, especially in the e-commerce, with how e-commerce is taking off. Absolutely. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. And because the suppliers very clearly understand then the business implications of not doing this, and it's information the suppliers have. So, there's not a lot of confusion in there, as well as it's pretty straightforward. I can connect that to the business implications. The other one I would say, and so there's obviously that very specific business case.
Yeah.
The other thing that we see is when they get very focused on starting with new items that they're bringing into their assortment and automating that process. A lot of times we'll see the retailers want to go out and clean up current items. And for the most part, suppliers are only mildly interested on providing you a bunch of additional item information for items you're already carrying.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well,
right, there's no incentive for them. Yeah, right. I never thought about that.
You're already selling it. Now you want me to do a bunch more work on an item you're already selling? Like, that's going to be a little bit harder versus, I need to set up a new item, and here are the expectations, and this is what the flow is. And the reality is, a lot of times buyers are having to know this information to even make a buying decision. And now they just kind of take it and say, well, then my consumers need that same information in their buying process. So here's the path to do it. So those are a couple of the ways I think we're seeing the most success in the retailers we're working with tackling this.
Yeah, Brandon, I was curious if I love the DC example, because I think that's a great, like, from the operations side, things that are impacting how retailers are getting products to their consumers faster. Are there any other things that retailers, like, as we talked about in the beginning, like new buy online pickup from store, or curbside pickup, or working with a third party picker like an Instacart or something? Are there any other things that are causing issues for the retailers that you've seen that kind of tie back to not having the right product information in place, or that's impacting that?
Yeah. One of the things is multi-channel or omni-channel. And we've certainly heard this, for a number of years now, as all of us in retail are trying to tackle where the consumer is shopping. But some of the ways you can start to see that show up is, a lot of times we'll hear like e-com attributes be something that retailers want to address. Well, e-com attributes start to give item specifications around how to actually think about purchasing the item. Well, I'm in the store, and I might want very similar item specifications when I'm in the store too. So I might talk to a store team member, or I might be sitting there at the shelf and looking for information. And we see a lot more digital signing that's showing up in stores that has these specifications. You see the stores teams going online to do research, and they can't even find the information, to flyers that the retailers are putting together for their stores on how to think about selling items. So suddenly, what seems like an e-com attribute to the supplier, that suppliers are maybe only mildly interested in providing, because they're kind of like, well, if you're selling my product online, like, anybody can sell it online. But if all of a sudden you're connecting that to a multi-channel experience, which we are seeing more and more, those attributes show up in every single channel, well, suddenly there's a bunch more value in my ability to provide it.
Yeah. You're bringing back nightmares for me, Brandon. Like, I can remember working in a store back in 2011. It was the Christmas time frame, the holiday time frame, and A woman I was helping had me literally take out a tape measure and measure the dimensions of every single Sterilite tote.
Oh my gosh.
In a 24-foot run of storage and organization at Target. Because it was at a time before what you're talking about was really understood or known. There was no place for me as a store associate to go and put into my PDA, what are the dimensions of each of these boxes? Now, they were written there. She didn't want to buy that, but, you know, having that system to tell me that that's the way it works would have been so helpful. So yes, 100%. You're bringing back nightmares for me. Thanks a lot, man.
The one thing to add on there, and I think this goes with Brandon's answer to the previous question too, is those, again, we talked about the foundation, we talked about the e-commerce attributes, right? One of the things that we spend a lot of time talking to our customers is you also can't get there overnight, right? Like a lot of times competitors have their eye, or their, you know, retailer or whatever might have their eye on a competitor and say like, I need to be like them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go put this all on my suppliers, or I'm going to get there overnight. It's a journey, right? Like most things. And I think another thing that we really harp on our customers is you got to be realistic, and you also have to work with your suppliers on it. And also some of the things won't come from your suppliers, right? Like a lot of the long description, a lot of the, you know, like bring it to life descriptions and things, vendors are probably not going to be the best at writing those, because if they write them, it's going to be for their brand. It's not going to be for your brand. It's not going to take into account any uniqueness you guys have or you talk about, right? So it is not just, you know what, I see 10 attributes and I'm going to go ask for them all. You also have to think about how do you go get them? Like, and does it make sense? Is that something that I need to take on, right? Versus asking my suppliers for, right? Those dimensions. Dimensions are sometimes hard if they don't have their own e-commerce site too, right? Like they might have the case dimension or pallet dimension, but maybe not the individual units, right? So again, we work a lot with our retailers to understand their own customer base. Where are you at in your journey? How much of a lift is it going to be? Because the easier you can make it, the faster it's going to be, but then might require like a second round later or something like that. So again, communication is key, like most things in life. And this is no different. So,
well, I have to imagine too, with like more retailers and brands that we talk to leveraging tools like Gen AI to write those product descriptions or to really use that to help the findability of their products online. Like all of this information has got to be there in a standard way so that they can train their models to write these types of things, I would imagine. I want to go and kind of close our conversation with the more advice that you have. Like, what actions do the listeners right now need to take to get their item data ready for those types of scenarios, and really to be in a good place to really set that foundation for the next couple of years into the future? Nick, maybe elaborate on that for a little bit. And then Brandon, I'd love to hear from you afterward too, about what customers are telling you.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think we covered, and I just kind of belabor that point a little bit, so I won't repeat too much. But I think always starting with like the foundation, right? If you're not starting at the beginning of just how do you onboard those new items, kind of like Brandon talked about, that is where that is where we see a lot of changeover and a lot of opportunity, right? A lot of retailers we talk to are changing over 15 to 25% of their SKU base every single year. Well, if you think about that, if for 2 years, all of a sudden, if that's 50% of my items, I'm actually doing pretty good. Yeah. So if you're gonna focus on it, focus on your new stuff first, and then that will also help inform what do I actually need out of the current ones that I have. Yeah. Working with your suppliers, retailers work with their suppliers each and every day. But with item data, it seems to be a little bit trickier, as Brandon hit on it earlier. They don't want to go back and work on items you're already selling in their store today. There's nothing in it for me, right? So you need to be able to articulate the why, right? Like we always talk about, like, ask 7 whys and you'll finally get to the right answer. Like, make sure you can defend it, right? If you're going to work with ask more from your suppliers, what's in it for them? What are you getting out of it? Like, how is that going to help the partnership? I think a couple other things to keep in mind too, depending on the industry, there's always going to be government things that come down, right? Like you're seeing like some ESG, FSMA things come through right now, and depending on what vertical, traceability, right, for grocery, there's always going to be those things too, and you have to be able to react quickly. And there probably will be even more of them as you get into more, like a little bit more global, like everything gets back to that. And so I think if you don't have a good foundation, pivoting to some of those things is only going to be a heavier lift as you step forward, right? Or you decide to go do a PIM, right? Like you decide to go do anything, whether it's mandated or not. Having that foundation done sooner rather than later, not only is it going to be better for you, for your suppliers, but also your own internal employees to make sure they focus on, the things that are super important to your brand and growing you as a retailer. So.
Yeah. And Nick, I imagine that's not just government requirements. That's also consumer requirements. Like,
oh, yeah, totally.
Getting back to like what Chris was talking about in the store, measuring the totes, and what Brandon was talking about too. Like, I imagine customers are going to start asking things of the associates in the store or online. Like,
Absolutely.
where was this made? How was it made?
Yeah, and and that spans so many categories. Like a lot of us think about, is our clothing come from a sustainable source, things like that. But we're working with some like building supply retailers right now. It's even important for like, where did this bamboo wood come from? Did it come from a replenishable source and like like good for the environment, or did somebody just like go cut down the forest and give it to us, right? So again, country of origin, those types of things, so influenced by the consumers, not even government regulated. But if you don't have it, you're not going to sell it because nobody's going to trust it. Or, it's from the wrong place, right? You see that a lot overseas right now, and I'm sure that'll make its way over here too.
Well, and the other point too, they made, this is going to get factorially more complicated too, because as you start talking particularly about ESG, which is really smart to bring up, those regulations are going to vary by state and municipality, not just on a national level. So if you don't have a handle on this, good luck. It's going to get more difficult.
Correct.
Yeah, I mean, along those lines, Chris, you said earlier, if it's not coming from a top-down CEO initiative, it's sometimes hard to drive things through. I will say we're working with a rather large retailer right now on mapping some of this out well in advance of them buying a PIM. And it basically came from their CEO coming down to their organization and saying, how can I be selling products in my store when I don't even know some of the critical points around where did the item come from? What's in the item? Right. How can I feel responsible to my consumer if I can't answer those questions? And so obviously that's a pretty direct mandate to the organization. And we all know it's really hard then to be able to go back and get that. But that's a big effort that they're now going through and kind of mapping out the supply chain end to end. And where do I need to collect and connect these data points? But
yeah, that's a great point and a very comforting point to end on. I'm glad to hear that is happening. And man, this has been a great conversation. Super fast, super lively, a ton of fun. Love the points you made too, particularly about, the incentives around new items versus old items and trying to tackle one thing and get that done well. There's a lot to learn from what you guys shared in this conversation. So if people want to get in touch with either one of you, want to learn more, get in touch with SPS Commerce to help them with their item data needs, what's the best way for them to do that? Nick, why don't you take that one?
Yeah. So, for Brandon and I, obviously we're talking to customers every single day. Would love to chat with anybody that's got questions or comments or, opinions on this too. Because that's kind of how we gather ours. Like Brandon and I are both on LinkedIn, more than happy to engage with anybody that wants to. From an SPS Commerce standpoint, we have a ton of resources at our disposal, depending if you're a supplier, a retailer, 3PL, whatever it might be. Our website's a great place to start there. There is contact information directly to pick up the phone, call us, email us, fill out a form, whatever it might be. And that gets you connected to the right people. So obviously we're happy to engage. And then the rest of SPS Commerce is here to support also.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for being here. That wraps us up today. Thanks to Brandon Pierre and Nick Schwalbach of SPS Commerce for sitting down with us and taking us through all that is required when you think about your item data needs as a retailer and a brand in today's retail industry. And thanks to all of you that joined us live on LinkedIn as well. As always, on behalf of all of us here at Omni Talk, be careful out there.